Explanation of the book, Talking to Strangers. Malcolm Gladwell, memoir. The book Talking to Strangers is one of Malcolm Gladwell's most controversial and thought-provoking books. The author explores how humans misinterpret the intentions of strangers and why this error sometimes leads to dangerous consequences. Gladwell draws on real-life examples, historical investigations, and scientific research in psychology and human behavior to explain why we fail to understand others correctly and how we can improve our ability to communicate with them. The main idea of the book. Gladwell focuses on the idea that humans have an innate tendency to misunderstand strangers because they rely on unreliable cues such as facial expressions, body language, or cultural preconceptions. These errors in communication can lead to serious misjudgments, whether in individual cases such as police interactions with citizens or in global issues such as espionage and political deception. The main issues discussed in the book. 1. The default to truth. What is the default to truth? Humans automatically assume that others are telling the truth, even if there was evidence to the contrary. This phenomenon makes people vulnerable to deception because they don't expect the person they're talking to be lying. Examples from the book, Bernie Madoff. This man ran one of the biggest financial frauds in history, deceiving investors for decades despite clear signs that he was a fraud. The problem wasn't just that he was deceiving, it was that people weren't ready to believe that he was lying. Ana Montes, an American spy who worked for Cuba while working for the Defense Intelligence Agency. No one suspected her of cheating for years because she showed no obvious signs of suspicion. Lesson learned. People need to be more aware that others may not always be honest and that it's important to verify information rather than automatically assume that everyone is honest. 2. Transparency illusion. What is transparency illusion? Humans believe they can tell other people's feelings and intentions from their facial expressions or body language. But Gladwell explains that this idea is not always true, as people differ in the way they express their emotions. Examples from the book. The Amanda Knox Case. Amanda Knox was an American student who was accused of killing her classmate in Italy. One of the reasons the police suspected her was that she did not act as people would expect an innocent person to act, as she appeared calm and collected. But this was just her personality, not evidence of her guilt. The Sandra Bland Case. Sandra Bland, an African-American woman, was stopped by a police officer for minor reasons, but her actions were misinterpreted as a threat, leading to her arrest and eventually committing suicide in prison. Lesson learned. We should be more careful when judging other people's emotions based on their facial expressions or behavior, as people express themselves differently. 3. The impact of cultural context on understanding others. What is the impact of context? Culture plays a major role in how we interpret other people's behavior. People may misunderstand someone's actions because they come from a different culture than their own. Examples from the book. The difference between facial expressions in different cultures. In some cultures, smiling when feeling nervous is common, while in other cultures, smiling in a serious situation may seem strange. This difference can lead to major misunderstandings. Indirect communication styles. In some cultures, feelings are not expressed directly, while in other cultures, people are expected to be direct in their speech. Lesson learned. When interacting with people from different cultures, we should be aware of the differences in communication styles and not assume that everyone expresses their feelings in the same way. 4. Self-deception and society. Why do we fail to detect lies? Because of our tendency to assume honesty, it is very difficult to detect deceitful people, especially if they are adept at manipulating information. Examples from the book. The Ana Montes spy case. Although she had been sending classified information to Cuba for years, no one suspected her because she was not behaving in a suspicious manner. The Larry Nassar Scandal. The USA gymnastics team doctor who abused hundreds of girls for decades. Although many victims reported his behavior, no one believed him at first because of his professional status and the respect people had for him. Lesson learned. We must learn to be more careful in judging others and not rely solely on our intuition or preconceptions. 5. The Sandra Bland tragedy and the effect of power on interactions with strangers. What happened? Sandra Bland was stopped by a traffic cop for a minor violation. When she began to argue with him, the cop interpreted her behavior as threatening, and the confrontation escalated to her arrest, where she later committed suicide in her cell. What does Gladwell illustrate here? The tendency of some people in positions of power to misunderstand the intentions of others. How a simple misunderstanding can have serious consequences if not handled wisely. The role of preconceptions in making some people seem more dangerous than they actually are. Lesson learned. We must realize that interacting with strangers may be more complicated than we think, and that we should not rush to judge others based on superficial actions. The main message of the book. Gladwell wants to show that many of the problems in the world are caused by our misunderstanding of strangers. We think we can read people easily, but in reality, this skill is much more difficult than we realize. The solution is not to stop trusting others completely, but to be more aware of how we make judgments. How can we improve our understanding of strangers? 1. Verify information instead of always assuming honesty. 2. Recognize that body language and facial expressions are not always indicative of truth. 3. Consider cultural context when communicating with people from different backgrounds. 4. Avoid making snap judgments about others without clear evidence. Conclusion. Talking to Strangers is an important book that shows how misunderstandings can lead to personal, social, and political disasters. Gladwell invites the reader to think more deeply about how they understand others and to develop more nuanced communication skills. Malcolm Gladwell uses a series of real-life stories that show how people misunderstand strangers, leading to disastrous consequences. Here are some of the most notable stories in more detail. 1. Bernie Madoff. How he fooled everyone? Who was Bernie Madoff? Bernie Madoff was an American businessman and investor, best known for being the mastermind behind the largest financial fraud in Wall Street history. What did he do? Madoff ran an investment fund in a manner known as a Ponzi scheme, promising investors steady and large returns. But in reality, he used new investors' money to pay returns to old investors, rather than actually making profits from the investments. Why didn't anyone question him? He had an excellent reputation on Wall Street and was a former chairman of the Nasdaq Stock Exchange. He seemed respectable and calm, which made him trustworthy. Even when some experts presented evidence that his scheme could not have been legal, authorities ignored these warnings because they did not expect him to lie. How did the scheme collapse? During the financial crisis of 2008, investors began demanding their money back. Madoff was unable to pay the money back because the scheme was based on new cash flows, not real investments. It all came crashing down when he confessed to his sons that he was running a massive fraud, and they reported him. Here, lesson learned. This story shows how people tend to assume honesty even when there are clear warning signs. Worse too, the Knox case. How misunderstandings led to an innocent conviction? Who is Amanda Knox? Amanda Knox was an American student studying in Italy when her roommate Meredith Kircher was murdered in 2007. Why did she become the prime suspect? The police noticed that her behavior seemed strange after the crime. She wasn't crying as much as investigators expected. She was caught laughing and having fun with her boyfriend on the street shortly after the crime. What actually happened? The police assumed that Amanda was acting indifferent because she was guilty. She was charged and detained based on false assumptions. Later, forensic evidence revealed that the crime was committed by another person named Rudy Guede, a known criminal, whose fingerprints were found at the crime scene. Despite this, the courts continued to prosecute her, and she was initially convicted before being finally acquitted after years of trials. What went wrong? The investigators made the mistake of transparency of expression, assuming that her behavior should reflect her true feelings. In reality, everyone expresses their emotions differently, and Amanda's behavior was not evidence of guilt. Lesson learned. We can't always judge people based on how they express themselves, because facial expressions and behavior are not uniform among all humans. 3. Sandra Bland. How a misunderstanding led to tragedy? Who is Sandra Bland? Sandra Bland was an African-American woman who was stopped by a Texas police officer for a minor traffic violation in 2015. What happened? During her interaction with the officer, Sandra became frustrated and responded angrily. The officer interpreted her anger as a threat and, instead of calming the situation down, decided to arrest her. She was taken to jail, and 3 days later, she was found dead in her cell, reportedly committing suicide. How could this tragedy have been avoided? The officer could have handled the situation in a calmer and more professional manner, rather than escalating it. If the police officer had understood that her reaction was the result of fear and stress, and not a threat to him, it would not have come to this point. This misunderstanding is a clear example of how a failure to communicate between strangers can lead to disastrous results. Lesson learned. We should be more aware that people's reactions do not always mean what we think, and that it is necessary to treat others with caution and compassion. For Ana Montes, the spy, how she spied for Cuba without anyone suspecting her? Who is Ana Montes? Ana Montes was an intelligence analyst working for the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, but she was actually a spy for Cuba. How did she manage to fool everyone? She looked like a normal, dedicated employee. She did not act suspiciously, which made her difficult to detect. Her colleagues had no reason to suspect her, as they assumed she was honest and loyal to her job. How was she exposed? After years of working as a spy, the authorities began to suspect that she was passing classified information to Cuba. She was eventually arrested and convicted of espionage and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Lesson learned. This example shows that deceitful people can be very adept at manipulating others, and that appearances cannot always be trusted. Final message from the book. Malcolm Gladwell wants to say that we as humans are not very good at understanding strangers because we use the wrong tools to judge them. We tend to 1. Presume honesty. We assume that others are telling the truth, even when they are deceiving. 2. Rely on body language. We believe that facial expressions and behavior reflect true feelings, but they can be deceiving. 3. Make snap judgments. We quickly decide whether someone is good or bad based on brief interactions. How can we be better at understanding strangers? Don't rush to judge others based on appearances alone. Realizing that some people can be deceitful, even if they seem trustworthy. Understanding that different cultures express emotions in different ways. Empathizing with others and trying to see things from their point of view. Conclusion. Talking to strangers is a call to rethink the way we judge others. The stories Gladwell tells prove that failure to understand strangers can lead to financial losses, wrongful convictions, unnecessary violence, and even human tragedies. If we learn how to deal with strangers more mindfully, we can reduce misunderstanding and make the world a more understanding place.